Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Understanding the Basics of Dialectical Behavior Therapy, or DBT, Foundational Skills for Supportive Housing Staff. My name is Crystal Sosha, and I'm one of the Senior Training and Consultation Specialists here at Rutgers School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. Once again, welcome. This webinar was made possible in partnership with Rutgers Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions, as well as the Foundational Community Supports Team at DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority. This is an interactive training, and we encourage you to ask questions and participate throughout this session. You have access to the chat, so you will be able to respond and interact in that way. The slides, as well as the link to the recording of this webinar, will be sent by email after this presentation. A couple additional housekeeping items before we begin. So your audio and video are muted. You do have the ability to use your computer audio or call in. To ask or respond to questions, just use the chat and respond to everyone. I see some of us are responding to host and panelists. Just make sure that you press those three dots on the side of your chat bar, and you should be able to respond to everyone. There might be a blue bar that says with a drop-down arrow, and you can click everyone, just so that we can all see your responses. You can also download the chats in the chat box by saving chat at the end of this presentation if you so choose to. As far as accessibility, subtitles are available and our captions are accessible at this point. Feel free to press more and show captions on your Zoom toolbar. If you ever have any accessibility concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to us so that we can provide accommodations. This webinar, once again, is being recorded, and this presentation and recording will be shared with you thereafter. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. So just starting with an outline. So we are in session 1. This is an introduction to dialectical behavior therapy and strategies specific for mindfulness. So DBT has 4 core modules, and we'll go through some of these throughout our series. Next week is session 2. So same time, same place. If you are able to join us for strategies for distress tolerance. We also hope to offer session 3 and 4 in the future, so stay tuned for registration for that. But for now, this link will provide you access to the session that you're in now, as well as next week's session 2, strategies for distress tolerance, which is my personal favorite. So hope to see you there as well. Again, welcome to session 1, Introduction to DBT and Strategies for Mindfulness. Just some learning objectives to get us started and kind of frame our day today. We've got a lot to cover, so looking forward to some of your interaction and engagement throughout this process. We will talk a little bit about DBT's history, framework, and an overview of the treatment structure. We'll talk a little bit about some of the key components of DBT, including mindfulness, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. We'll take some time to understand some of the mindfulness strategies and how they are important in DBT. And mindfulness really is the center and the core of DBT and the skills that we teach. And we'll take time to review a case study to apply some of these skills with clients, and feel free to share any examples or feedback questions throughout this presentation. So I'd like to start with a little activity that really, I think, in my opinion, frames the way that we look at DBT. So I'm going to ask if you are able to, in the chat, let me know. I'm going to show 2 images and I'll describe them thereafter. So let me know what you see in these 2 images. I'll show one. So what do you see in this image? See 2 faces, candle holder, 2 faces and a vase, 2 faces, 2 people looking at each other, 2 faces, an hourglass, a vase, candlestick. Okay. Phase and two faces, face. Two faces in the white and a candlestick in the black. Flower pot stand. Okay. So I won't give any feedback just yet, and I will describe these in detail in just a moment. What about this image? What do you see? The image on the right. See old lady, young woman, a lady, woman with fur coat, or a young lady, old woman and a young woman, lady, a woman in a fur coat, a woman looking away, crown and beauty, a classy woman facing right, lady with a hat, sophisticated young lady. We've got a lot of great adjectives here. Woman looking away in a fur coat. Okay, great. So when we're looking at this first image on the left, most people, as many of you described, will describe this photo as two faces. So this image on the left is two white heads in the background facing each other. And then in the middle of that is a black vase. So people often see two faces or the vase. They may see both. I didn't want to prompt you either way. And then on the right, individuals often, as you all had mentioned as well, either see an image of a young woman or an older woman. And if I told you that, let's say this picture on the right was only a picture of a young woman, would I be correct? No. And if I said this image on the left was only an image of a vase, would I be correct? I see an overwhelming no's. Right. So in this case, both are true. And we're all perceiving this image differently. So the image on the right then shows either this woman looking to the left, so you see her eyes and chin over here facing towards the left, or you may see an older woman. You may see this is kind of like her hair, her bangs, her nose, and then many described his chin and the fur coat. And there's so many variations of these images, but we are all perceiving this image very differently. We may see both, we may see one or the other, but this is really a visual example of multiple ways to see an image and both as being true. And a lot of what we talked about or will talk about in DBT is about dialectics, this idea that two opposing truths can be true. And this is so important because our perception can actually influence our judgment and the way that we look at a certain situation. So we'll talk a little bit about how that also coincides with mindfulness and how to be mindful without judgment. But again, thank you for taking the time to engage in this activity and keeping these two images in mind, noticing both either or can be true, and how our perceptions really do shape our reality and shape our judgment. And much of that we'll talk about is influenced by biology, genetics, and all of these things, and environment as well. All right. Okay, so let's keep moving. We are going to then talk about in more detail about DBT and how it is connected and very important, especially in the work that we do in supportive housing. And many of you may have either been to some of our webinars before, perhaps not, perhaps this is new information, maybe this is a refresher for you, but I do like to just get a sense of where you are all at. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not familiar at all, 10 being extremely familiar, how familiar are you with dialectical behavior therapy? Let me know in the chat. All right, seeing a mix of ranges here. And have no fear if you are brand new to this. Hopefully this gives you an overview of what DBT is. as a modality and as skills that can be very much applicable in community settings, especially in supportive housing. Some of this may be a refresher to you, so stay tuned for that. But again, this is really just serving as a foundational overview. So hoping that if you are interested in what you hear, you want to learn more, and you find some resources to do that, which I'll share at the end as well. Okay, so the D in dialectical behavior therapy stands for dialectical. A dialectic, as I mentioned before, is this synthesis of two opposing truths or the integration of opposites. So it's both and rather than either or. And in dialectical behavior therapy, there is really this combination of acceptance and change. So this idea that opposites can coexist, both can happen at the same time. And Marsha Linehan, who really created DBT, which we'll talk about in the next slide, really realized that there was too much focus on the validation piece or the acceptance, or the opposite side, too much focus on the behavior change and very much being solution-oriented. Practitioners felt like clients needed to make this change. We're going to goal set, but maybe we're missing out on the validation piece. So practitioners were getting stuck on either end. They were either providing all the validation with no behavior change or all the behavior change with no level of validation. So clients often felt invalidated, even if they were being given skills. And so Marsha Linehan talked about combining these two aspects of acceptance and change, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So the B stands for behavior. And again, DBT does really require a behavioral approach. This means that we assess the situations that clients bring to us, and we explore their goals, and we try to figure out how to solve the problems in their lives and equip them with the tools so that they can be successful in solving their problems as well. So this really gives hope that behavior change and behaviors are changeable. And then the T for therapy, and in this case, oftentimes in supportive housing, we're really providing interventions or techniques. So adding that caveat there that these techniques are very much applicable, accessible, and feasible when delivered in a community setting. So you have whatever tools, or you will learn all these tools and be able to use them in the community as you so choose to. So we'll learn a little bit about the structure of DBT in its traditional format, but again, highlighting that these tools are easily used in the community. Okay. So just some history before we get into some of the skills here. In DBT, as I mentioned, it was originally developed in the mid to late 19th century by Marsha Linehan and her colleagues, and she was really initially first studying suicide and suicidal behavior. Later, we found out that Marsha Linehan herself also had a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. Originally, DBT was tailored for this population, but has since been applied to other populations. So this was very much prior to her knowledge about borderline personality disorder, where she discovered that cognitive behavior therapy, or that behavioral piece alone, was not as successful and did not work as well with individuals with borderline personality disorder. So clients often experience some of those change-focused interventions as invalidating. They felt misunderstood, they felt criticized, and then they ended up withdrawing from treatment, ending care, not showing up to appointments, felt a lot of anger towards their therapists, counselors, practitioners, staff. So that's when DBT really later transitioned from some of those interventions and combined both cognitive behavior therapy as well as this mindfulness and humanistic approach to emphasize both acceptance and change. So we are supporting the client's change as well as the validation of this person. So that is a quick overview and a lovely image of Marsha Linehan on the left side here. We'll talk a little bit about some populations. So just checking in with all of you, what are some populations that you are currently serving, or perhaps diagnoses that you see most often, behaviors that you're often working with when working with individuals in the community? Chronic homelessness or unhoused. See homelessness with disability, and many of us being in supportive housing, likely working with individuals who are unhoused. See substance use, antisocial personality disorder, PTSD, bipolar, schizophrenia, suicidal ideation, substance use or mental health. Okay. Aging population. So we've got a whole mix of individuals. Okay. All right. So I just want to highlight that because one, you're doing so much meaningful work, and two, DBT really is applicable to many different populations. And we know that oftentimes, although DBT was traditionally geared for individuals with borderline personality disorder, there are so many coexisting conditions that do exist. So research did find that DBT was effective for many of these populations that you will see listed here. So from generalized anxiety disorder to bipolar disorder, for eating disorders, major depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance use, many of these things that we mentioned, and is effective regardless of a person's age, sex, gender identity, race, ethnicity. So keep all of that in mind as you are working with individuals. Of course, you know the people that you serve best, so maybe you're tailoring these interventions in a way that works for them, but keeping that in mind that it can be effective for many populations. And so when we look at DBT, oftentimes in our traditional format, just providing you with some of this information as context, DBT traditionally requires that individuals who are admitted to these levels of care or programs that are specific to DBT are individuals who are experiencing intense symptoms. And that could look different for each person, but that could look like flashbacks or high anxiety, emotional lability, mood lability, emotion dysregulation. Maybe they experience a lot of dissociation and it makes it difficult for them to engage in services. Perhaps it's difficult for them to get any benefit from a traditional process group or a group where people are uncovering the depths of their trauma and they're going into detail. Maybe that's too dysregulating for them or it's too overwhelming for them. People who also access DBT-specific treatment are individuals with a history of repeated substance use, relapses, suicide attempts, self-injurious behavior, hospitalizations. These individuals may be at high risk and require daily check-ins. These individuals may also have deficits in 2 or more modules, and we'll go through each of these modules, including specifically today, mindfulness. This person may also meet or has features of borderline personality disorder. And many of us mentioned working with individuals who are unhoused, who perhaps have a diagnosis of PTSD, or perhaps likely have experienced trauma of some kind. We know that individuals with borderline personality disorder have a history of sexual abuse that's repeated and severe over time, but they also experience many of the symptoms that we've mentioned. So they may experience emotion dysregulation. They may have difficulty with anger. They may experience interpersonal dysregulation. They may have unstable relationships, or they may have behavioral dysregulation. So they may have frequent suicidal ideation, suicide attempts. They could have self-injurious behavior. They could engage in self-destructive or self-damaging behaviors, impulsive behaviors. So it's so helpful, especially when working with individuals with borderline personality disorder, to educate them about their diagnosis. I find that this helps them to not feel alone, and that they can name this experience and feel validated if this is someone that you are working with. Oftentimes, as practitioners or staff, we kind of tiptoe around the diagnosis, of course, making sure that this is what this person is experiencing. Some find it helpful, some do not, but providing some education on what that really looks like can be helpful. Okay. And again, in DBT, we also have a specific structure. So what this might look like in its traditional model is that it doesn't take about 6 months to a year to engage in this treatment. But each program is different, and we're over in New Jersey, and programs here look different than in Washington, look different than in California. But it's in its traditional format. DBT generally takes about 6 months to a year. But again, needless to say that these skills are very much applicable in supportive housing, especially when we're working with individuals who are experiencing some of these symptoms of anxiety or depression, or they are working on building relationships with landlord, with tenant, with a neighbor, with person down the street. They're working on their recovery and forming relationships. So all of these skills can be helpful. But DBT can be included or is included in both an individual format as well as a group skills format. And in those groups, we often start off with a little mindfulness exercise, talk about skills that were covered in the past, perhaps, or homework review. Individuals are also educated on a new skill in that group. And this skill can be multiple days a week. So think about your partial care, partial hospitalization programs, intensive outpatient programs like that, where you're seeing individuals multiple times a week and they're provided skills multiple times a week in a group setting. DBT also includes phone coaching, where individuals are able to access a therapist or counselor and be able to be provided with additional skills. So they're able to explore what skills they've already tried, as well as be provided with this kind of opportunity to re-engage with skills in that moment. DBT also includes a weekly therapist consultation meeting where staff are meeting together to talk about individuals, and of course, pharmacotherapy or medication management. Okay, so we'll talk now about some of the framework as it relates to DBT, and we're going to talk about biosocial theory, which I find quite helpful because the foundation of DBT really lies in being as skillful and effective as possible. So when we talk about skills, they're really a group of skills or skills that are grouped together in modules that achieve a specific goal. So today we'll talk about mindfulness, but we want to talk about skills in a way that skills can be effective or ineffective, or skills can be adaptive or maladaptive. And we'll talk about in just a moment how mindfulness is really the foundation for all of the skills, which we'll discuss in just a moment. But biosocial theory is really the framework that we go from in DBT and tells us how and why some people have so much difficulty regulating their emotions. So many of us might be familiar thinking about the impact of biology and environment. So this idea that each of us are influenced by our genetics, which then influences our behavior, which then influences our environment, which then in turn reacts to and influences us in this never-ending transactional relationship. And so emotional vulnerability is often biological. So some of the symptoms that you may see with individuals in supportive housing, maybe we're feeling frustrated, maybe we're confused where these behaviors are coming from, but all behaviors do come from somewhere, and they're not random, and they're always serving a purpose or serving a function, because those emotions really allow us to communicate to ourselves and to others. And regulating action based on some of those emotions is more difficult for some than others because of this emotional vulnerability. And with that, the final piece of this biosocial theory is that an invalidating environment makes it difficult to regulate emotions. So all of these pieces together, both biology and environment, do impact the way that we are seeing individuals and the experiences that happen for them. So what comes to mind when you think of an invalidating environment? And I'm a cat person, so you may see cat pictures throughout this presentation. Maybe you're imagining this sad cat like I was, but what comes to mind when you think of invalidating environment? See, hostile, dismissive, cold, lack of empathy. Being judged, gaslighting, passive aggressiveness. Doesn't feel welcome. Somewhere where someone's sexual gender identity are not respected. us versus them mentality, lack of respect, honesty, one where it's not safe for me to voice issues or concerns, avoidant, controlling, manipulative, distrust, lack of respect, hostility. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of similar themes happening in some of the words that we're using, and absolutely. And so I see another good one. If it's not my way, it's wrong. Yeah. And whether these are things that perhaps you might be familiar with, whether these are things that you often see in the individuals that you serve, we may have experienced this to some level, and keeping in mind what this looks like for the people that we serve. So when we look at an invalidating environment, it is many of those things that you all mentioned. So it could be an environment that punishes expression of emotions, especially in public. So we'll look at, for example, thinking about a child. This might look like an adult telling a child, go to your room until you stop being angry. So this child is now forced to figure out what to do with those big feelings and go to their room until they are, quote, perhaps able to no longer be angry. This might also look like an environment that oversimplifies problem solving. So think about the times where individuals may have told another person, relax, just breathe, it's not that big of a deal. That's one that we hear quite often. And oftentimes when someone's being told to relax, it's quite the opposite experience. An environment that says emotions are weird, wrong, or bad. So maybe, again, I'm going to turn to childhood because this, of course, influences how we are seeing adults. But perhaps telling a child that is such a dumb thing to say as it relates to their emotions. An environment that denies or discounts an individual's personal emotional experience. So they might be saying, a parent or an adult saying to a child, you don't feel sad, you're angry. Nobody else would feel that way. An environment that reinforces escalations of emotional responses. So maybe this adult is paying attention to the escalated emotions only and intermittently. So often communicates that these emotions are unwarranted. So let's say a child is riding a bike, the child falls off the bike, the child is crying, not so much attention from the parent until the parent or adult starts to feel bothered, or those screams and cries get on the adult's, quote, nerves. And so now this parent or adult is responding to this child in a cold and stern way, rather than initially responding to that first moment of sadness as that child was screaming for help, falling off the bike. And then the last piece here, so this might include an environment that says emotions should be coped without support. So this might look like an adult telling a child, if you're going to keep crying, go to your room and come down when you're able to get a control of yourself. Again, similar to that punishing expression of those emotions, this person is going to go to their room and figure out what to do without any support. Child likely has no clue how to figure out what's happening to those emotions and is now struggling with figuring out how to get through that difficult feeling. So again, keeping in mind some of these examples of what this environment looks like, because this environment doesn't teach individuals how to label their emotions and how to help them understand what is sadness, what is anger, what is fear, what am I experiencing? It doesn't allow for them to be able to regulate their emotions or trust the experience. So then it becomes difficult. Maybe they're stuffing emotions and they're having a hard time tolerating distress, and they don't know how to solve problems on their own, and they don't know how to communicate effectively. Because all of these things perhaps weren't taught or were often ignored. Does this sound familiar for any of the people that you're working with, if you're working with adults at this point? Perhaps the difficulty of figuring out what those emotions are, struggling with tolerating with a crisis or distress. They don't know how to solve problems on their own. They often turn to you for support. Is that familiar? See, a lot of my clients struggle with labeling their emotions. Absolutely. Especially if they were never taught what that emotion is. Definitely, yeah. Yes. I see, especially for senior or perhaps older adult. Christian said, I recognize this a lot. Emotion is bad. Emotion is an emergency. Yes. And now we're stuck with trying to figure out how to resolve this, how to feel this, what to do with it, how to respond to this feeling. And so today we'll talk about mindfulness, but in another one of these sessions, we'll talk about emotion regulation and how to help clients label those emotions, because that's a big piece of figuring out what to do with those emotions as well. And so again, in DBT, we talk about borderline personality disorder as this pervasive disorder of the emotion regulation system. So again, it really stems from that invalidating environment. So all of these characteristics that we listed here, as well as that biological dysfunction in our emotion regulation system. So it's very difficult for this person to then navigate, okay, if perhaps their genetics already predispose them to this emotional vulnerability, on top of living in an environment where emotions are bad, emotions are wrong, don't feel anything. If you feel something, you're in trouble. How difficult that is to really walk through life in an effective way. And think about, I mean, this happens for adults too. Adults are often in environments that are still invalidating. We mentioned many of those really strong words where they're hostile. People, as adults, still experience some of these things. Another piece of the framework with dialectical behavior therapy is this dialectical philosophy. So keep in mind those images that we looked at in the very beginning of this presentation. Is anyone familiar with dialectics? If not, no worries. So when I think about dialectics, again, being part of the framework or philosophy, Botania, exactly, two things can be true at the same time. It's almost the opposite of black and white thinking or staying away from extreme ends, where instead of either or, it's both and. So this kind of synthesis of the two. I almost think of it like brain yoga, where you're balancing both sides to become more flexible. So you're helping clients really get rid or let go of that black and white or all or nothing rigid extreme thinking. So I'll give an example. Have you ever been around a group of people and still felt lonely? Yes, I'm seeing a bunch of yeses. And Tamara says no, but maybe out of place. Yeah. So dialectics really tell us you can be with others and be lonely. Some other examples that Marsha Linehan uses includes you can be independent and also want help. You know, you might be someone who values being independent, doing things on your own, and also it's okay for you to want to ask for help. You can have a disagreement with somebody and also be friends. So you may not agree with what this person's doing, and I find that to be a prevalent theme when working with individuals who are working on building relationships with others, because we're getting stuck in that black and white thinking. So this person can still have a disagreement with someone or disagree with what they do and still be friends or maintain a relationship with this person. So again, two opposing truths can be true at the same time, and it really is this synthesis of both perspectives. And it can be quite difficult to get there, but keeping that in mind that it's instead of either or, it's both and. Okay. In DBT, a lot of what is talked about are these skills training assumptions. And again, this is in its traditional format and giving you an overview just to support some of the context in the work that you do. But assumptions are beliefs that cannot be proved. So they're not facts, but they are kind of a set of guidelines that both the clinician and the client agree to abide by. And this is often important when we think about individuals that we work with. DBT is really driven by this notion that people don't want to stay sick. They're doing the best they can. They aren't trying to make things hard. They do want to improve, even those moments where they do feel stuck. You know, you may have clients that come in and say they're ready to change, and they get stuck in making that change, and you're both feeling frustrated. But a lot of these assumptions help guide us to help individuals increase their effectiveness through these skill modules. Okay, so keep some of these in mind. Again, not facts. It can't be proved. There could be other sides to these as well. But keep in mind as we are working with individuals, the goal of DBT and as we're teaching skills is that individuals, you'll see the last one, cannot fail. So we may feel frustrated that they're stuck. They may feel frustrated that they're stuck. This is so true for many of the things that happen, you know, especially finding housing, finding a job, and how difficult all of that might be. Sometimes individuals may simply lack the skills necessary. So that's where we really come in to offer some additional support. Maybe they're struggling with communicating with their landlord and they're at risk for eviction and working through some of these things, but feeling like a failure. Again, DBT tells us that individuals cannot fail, but sometimes they may be lacking some skills in supporting the situation, or the environment is simply more powerful or stronger than they are. And Tamara, thank you for that. Tamara says, have to remind myself that failure, quote, failure or failing shows an attempt I tried, and what can I or did I learn from that experience? Absolutely. Yeah, so think about Marcia Linehan gives an example in her book where she talks about, let's say, you are walking down the road and someone pushes you into the river. You can either say, this is so unfair, I can't believe it, I'm in the river. You can start crying, you can start screaming, you can not say anything and hope someone passes by and kind of give them the puppy eye look. Or you can recognize that although you didn't uh, cause this problem, you need to find a solution and you need to say what you need. So a lot of this is really about exploring skills, building skills, as well as, you know, there's really almost that piece of advocating for what you need. Okay. All right. So some primary targets of DBT, this is really where we think about goal setting. So when we think about goal setting in DBT, this overarching goal exists where we are supporting individuals in building a life worth living. And so what we're doing is helping the person that you're working with focus on what they do want rather than what they don't want. So let's say the person that you're working with doesn't want to drink anymore. Okay, what will happen if they stop drinking? What will come out of not drinking? What will you gain as a result of not drinking? Maybe this person tells you, okay, they won't get evicted from their housing. They'll be able to make new friends. They'll be able to build this recovery support system. So you're really exploring with them, what could they do if they could not fail? And then what behaviors are getting in the way? of those goals that they might have for themselves. And sometimes individuals say, well, there's no point in living. There's no such thing. I'll never find it. Life isn't worth living. And I think to some extent we can validate that is very true. And a lot of the work in DBT and the skills that you learn take time, effort, energy, commitment. So you're helping this person figure out what their life could look like. So really helping them to develop this ability to use skills in their daily life and be successful in achieving those goals. And a lot of goal setting we talk about is geared from motivational interviewing and exploring a person's readiness to change. So what are some questions that you ask when you are helping clients to set a goal? So this larger goal that you're working with, what are some questions that you might ask them? I see I would ask about the timeline. They want to reach that goal. Miracle question, if you woke up tomorrow and had the perfect life, what would that look like? How do you see yourself in the next year? Miracle question, I'm seeing that a lot, yes. Kind of continuing to probe this person, like asking more questions and then what, kind of playing this tape forward. Christine says, I would ask how we could break this down into smaller goals or objectives. Yeah. Maybe this person in 5 years wants to achieve X, Y, and Z job, but perhaps they need to start kind of at an entry level position before getting to that role. Okay, so where do you hope to be in 6 months? How would you like things to be different? And oftentimes, especially when we're thinking about substance use, we're really asking, what do you think you will lose if you give up X, Y, and Z? So if you give up drinking, what might you lose? So keep that in mind. This overarching goal, again, in DBT is really to support building a life worth living. We're instilling hope in individuals that change is possible. And then there are some other behaviors in DBT, but we won't get too much into these. But some other targets that are important when we think about traditional DBT include life-threatening targets, of course. So anything that might indicate a person's threat to themselves or others. Christine, I see, what are your values? Identifying values can help determine direction or purpose for the future. Yes, and DBT actually has a really great handout in their emotion regulation module. Exploring values, I forget the exact title. But it does give a breakdown of values because sometimes people get stuck in identifying like, what are values? What does this mean to them? So we can share that with you as well as we get closer there. But there is a great values handout to help individuals kind of look through and check off. And you can read them out loud or go through them as well. Okay. Another important thing when we are identifying goals in DBT, we talk about behaviors to increase and behaviors to decrease. And so the general goal of DBT is really to learn how to change behaviors, emotions, and thoughts that are often linked to some of those problems in living and perhaps causing those strong feelings of misery and distress. And so when you're working with someone and deciding goals, you're exploring behaviors that they need more of and behaviors that they need to decrease, minimize, let go of, which of course is difficult up front. So when we're thinking about behaviors to decrease, so someone who's experiencing mindlessness or the inability to stay mindful, they have a sense of emptiness, they're out of touch with reality, themselves and others. Maybe they're judgmental of themselves or others. We want to increase mindfulness skills, which we'll talk about today. For individuals who really struggle with interpersonal conflict and stress, perhaps loneliness, we want to increase interpersonal effectiveness skills. For those individuals who have extreme, intense emotions, we want to increase emotion regulation skills. And then for those individuals who may have impulsive behaviors, they may act without thinking, they have difficulties in accepting reality for what it is, they experience impulsive behaviors could also look like substance use, shopping, spending, sex, gambling. This person may need to increase some of their distress tolerance skills. And we know that behaviors that are reinforced will continue. So keep some of these things in mind as you are removing an old behavior, whether it's smoking, substance use, binging, purging, restricting, self-harm. You want to make sure that you are replacing with a new behavior. So this is true for any skill. So think about some of the goals that you're working on with individuals. If this person is working on decreasing substance use, someone mentioned hoarding behavior, or decluttering, maybe there's a sense of joy or satisfaction in some of these behaviors. How can you add another level of joy or pleasure or satisfaction into this person's life without just taking this one thing that they've known all their lives away from them? New behaviors must also be practiced. So again, a lot of this is teaching skills, and this person also needs to practice these skills in the environment that they live in. We also want to anticipate moments of difficulty or plan ahead. And there's a really great skill about coping ahead and planning for the future. If there's a difficult situation, you want to set this client or person up for success so that they're able to successfully get through a difficult moment. So if they're anticipating, I often give the example, or I will ask actually, how many of the locations or housing units that you serve or work in are located across from a liquor store or located across from your local vape shop or located across perhaps from your local convenience store even. If you are someone that works with a client who lives across from a liquor store, maybe you're thinking about how to plan ahead instead of going straight into the liquor store. Perhaps this person could take a left and go a different path to the location that they need to. Or perhaps they might call a friend for support if they know that this environment will be triggering for them. Another piece of DBT that we talk about is orienting individuals to pros and cons of using skills. So it can be quite helpful to talk about the good things or the pros about using skills and practicing skills, and then the pros and cons of not practicing skills. Especially when individuals aren't sure whether they should use a skill, we want to make sure that they are able to act skillfully and reach their goals. And so this can help clients decide whether or not it's helpful or not helpful, whether they will gain something or not gain something from DBT. So it's particularly useful when someone doesn't want to participate in any skills, perhaps is feeling stuck. I find it helpful to take one of these and either write it out with someone, have them put it in their pocket, take a picture of it, put it on your phone, whatever is most helpful for them. But being able to remind themselves of, okay, if the long-term goal is to find permanent housing, or if the long-term goal is to find a meaningful job, or if the long-term goal is to reconnect with a former family member, if we want to do this, perhaps we need to practice some skills to get there. So what are some of the good things about practicing this skill? Maybe it is, achieving that long-term goal and then exploring what might not be helpful if they don't practice those skills. The last piece that I'll talk about with, again, DBT is when we're introducing this kind of framework, we also talk about options for problem solving. So what are some ways, let's say life presents you with a problem, you name that problem. What do you typically do? What are some of your options? See, make a list of options available. Maybe get more information. Excuse me, look at all possible solutions. Talk it out with husband, best friend. Talk it out. Pros and cons. Absolutely. And this is a good reminder to keep that pros and cons. So in DBT, we talk about 4 problems, and I see someone mention identify the problem. Absolutely. Sometimes we don't even know what the problem really is, but we're feeling such an intense emotion, we don't know what to do. Talk to therapists. Okay. So there's 4 options that we talk about in DBT. Tamara says, if a goal is to say quit smoking, put a picture of something that you want to buy or do on a jar, and then when wanting to buy cigarettes, put the money in the jar. Great. So we can be creative in all these problem-solving strategies. I see talk it out with best friend. Usually getting all the thoughts out of my head helps me clear my thinking enough to figure out the best plan to move forward. Yeah, so we know so many different options that works well for us. And DBT talks in a similar language. So first, maybe there is an option to solve that problem. And we want to, as someone mentioned, identify all the details of that problem so that we can solve the problem that is causing us this distress or pain. So what are some perhaps fears that your clients have identified or conflicts? And I'll give an example to maybe prompt that idea. So if the person that you're working with, maybe their main source of conflict is with their partner. And if they choose to avoid the problem or get a divorce, maybe that's completely avoiding the problem rather than finding a way to solve the problem. That is a possible solution. But could this person be referred to couples counseling? Are there other options? So many of the things that you all mentioned includes laying out all the possible options. What are all the possibilities before jumping from one extreme to the next? Fear of failing is the biggest thing that is expressed to me from clients in regards to their housing. Absolutely. Yeah. I think it can be quite difficult when individuals are often comfortable with where they might be. It is difficult to try something new for anyone. I see boundaries, not able to say no. Yeah. So many different challenges that individuals do experience. And again, the first might be solve the problem if that's possible. But if you can't solve the problem, we want to teach individuals emotion regulation skills so we can try to feel better about the problem by changing our emotional response to it or regulating our emotion. We can also try to accept and tolerate that problem. So using distress tolerance skills, which we'll talk about next week. And then Marsha Linehan also talks about the 4th option being staying miserable. And what that really means is not using any skills or using ineffective skills. So this person might turn to substances, this person might turn to self-harm, this person might not have the skills to be effective. I see examples. What if the landlord says no? What if I lose my job? What if my kids don't like the new house or school? Yeah. And what if they do? What if they do say yes? But it is a lot of that questioning and feeling stuck with what could happen. And so DBT talks about this idea that this combination of pain plus non-acceptance or quote resistance leads to suffering. But if a person experiences pain, is able to have some sort of acceptance, they're able to reach and gain freedom. So we'll talk about this more next week. But each of these options requires skills. Or the final option is to stay miserable and stay suffering and not use any skills and not do anything about it. And stay stuck is often what happens. And again, no skills might just mean no effective skills. Okay. So that was super high level, mildly lengthy overview about DBT. We're going to transition into mindfulness. Any questions so far? Hoping that the framework was helpful. Again, keep in mind this idea of the biosocial theory, the combination of genetics and invalidating environment, and how you can support individuals in solving a problem. So we're going to transition into mindfulness, and you'll see the 4 modules are listed here, but today we'll talk about mindfulness. Next week, we'll talk about distress tolerance, which are the skills to be able to tolerate and accept reality and survive crisis situations without making them worse, to ultimately reduce that feeling of suffering. Emotion regulation, which includes, some of us mentioned, the clients that we serve have difficulties in labeling or naming emotions, and that's part of emotion regulation, as well as enhancing their ability to control those emotions to a certain extent. Marsha Linehan says that we are who we are to some degree, and emotionality is just part of us, but we can learn how to understand and name those emotions. And then interpersonal effectiveness skills really help us to maintain and improve relationships with people that we are close to, with strangers, with a neighbor, with an employer, employee, coworker, so on. So what is mindfulness? What does mindfulness mean to you? Seeing a lot of mindfulness experts. Amazing. Okay, so I'm seeing being grounded in the present moment, being present in the moment, being in the moment, intentional, thinking about something prior to action, being centered in the here and now, being in tune with our feelings and needs, awareness, remembering to remain trauma informed. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of awareness and focus on the present moment, which is exactly what mindfulness is. So noticing what's happening within us, what's happening around us, staying grounded, staying centered, having this awareness of what's happening. I look at mindfulness as simply noticing, especially situational awareness too. Yes, absolutely. So mindfulness within self and around us. So within what's happening within our body, what's happening in the environment. Open to now without expectation, making space for the emotions I have and the people around me may express, offering understanding to everyone involved as I'm able to. Jacqueline, if that's how I say your name, I want to be your friend. That sounds amazing. So yes, mindfulness is really noticing when the mind wanders and bringing it back, not quieting it, not pushing it away, not emptying the mind. But mindfulness really is that thread that runs through all things DBT, because without mindfulness, we're not able to identify goals. If we don't have any awareness or mindfulness, how can we identify a goal? If we don't have mindfulness, how can we use skills? How can we problem solve? How can we improve our well-being without mindfulness? Okay, so you'll see this overview, and this is directly from one of the mindfulness handouts from the DBT manual, which I'll share at the end, but just the one that is created by Marsha Linehan. So mindfulness talks about teaching individuals to really reduce that suffering and increase happiness. So we're helping individuals to increase control, awareness, focus on the present moment, noticing what's happening within us and what's going on outside of ourselves, experiencing reality as it is, and being less judgmental. And that is quite the challenge because we are judgmental creatures, whether that's a quote positive or quote negative judgment. We are often attaching a judgment to the things around us. But what we're doing here instead is letting go of that judgment as it relates to attaching to our thoughts, feelings, sensations, activities, events, life situations. So doing our best to be less judgmental. And so in DBT, there's a couple skills that we talk about. So we've got wise mind, states of mind. So that includes emotion mind, reasonable mind, and wise mind. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Mindfulness, what skills? So what you do to be mindful. You can observe, you can describe, you can participate. And then mindfulness how skills. So how you actually be mindful. And there's a few skills within this, including one mindfully, non-judgmentally, and effectively. And again, you'll hear this kind of running theme of non-judgmentalness throughout DBT. So the first one we'll talk about is wise mind. Is anyone familiar with wise mind? Yes. Okay. If you're not sure, don't worry. Okay. I see Dusty says out of your emotional head and into your logical. A little bit of that, yes. So wise mind, or the states of mind rather, really talk about where experience lives within us. So our reasonable mind is part of us, and it's the mind that is rational, logical, task-focused. 2 + 2 = 4 in any context. But rational or reasonable mind alone can allow us to lack empathy and compassion for ourselves and others. Emotion mind, on the other hand, is very much mood dependent or emotion driven. We're ruled by moods, feelings, urges to do or say things. But without emotion, we lose connection to meaning. And Dusty, exactly, yes, it's a balance of the two. So wise mind, which is really that wisdom within us, this is where our values lie. So we're able to see the value of both reason and emotion, and we're synthesizing those together. So when I ask individuals to really find a way to access their wise mind, or if they're wondering, am I accessing my wise mind? You can have them ask, or you can encourage them to ask themselves, is this something my wise mind would do? Is this thought, behavior, action, plan, wise mind? And so I share the example often when I'm thinking about this, just to give context. When I'm thinking about reasonable mind, let's say you are thinking about buying a car. So you go to the dealership, you do all your research, you find all the facts about this car, but you don't test drive it because research says it's a great car. And that's your reasonable mind. Your emotion mind says, okay, my favorite color is green, and I really love the color green. I see this car. I'm thinking about buying a car. Since it's green, it's my favorite color. I love it. I'm going to buy it. With our wise mind, we're now aligning both our preferences. So now we are aligning, okay, we like a green car. And can we also look at the research? Can we also test drive the car? Can we also understand monthly payments? Can we also figure out what we need to fit this within our financial constraints in today's economy? I'm not buying a car, but for this example, you know that this synthesis of both our reasonable mind and our emotion mind will help us to determine how we want to act on this thought, plan, action. So again, asking yourself, is this something my wise mind would do? When we're thinking about another mindfulness skill, this is probably one that we hear most often, but perhaps we don't have the label attached to it. But when we think about mindfulness in general, we think about what we need to do to be mindful, and often that includes observing and describing. So we are bringing our mind back to observing over and over and over, and noticing each time this person may be distracted. You're really practicing noticing distractions here. So mindfulness, what skills? Again, what you do to be mindful. And some ways to observe might look like observing with your eyes, sounds, smells, taste. So using those 5 senses, to observe and simply notice. Again, you're not putting any words or narrative to the experience. You are simply noticing. So this could look like sitting in a park and watching people pass by, watching kids play. You might observe your breath. You might observe thoughts coming and going out of your mind. And then when you're thinking about describing, you want to describe what you see. So this might look like describing clouds in the sky. So if I was describing this image to the left, I might say blue, shining sun, white, fluffy clouds. And so now I'm labeling what I'm seeing. If I'm describing my breathing rather than noticing it, so with observing, I might just notice the way my body is inhaling and exhaling, but with describing, I'm actually labeling. I'm inhaling and I'm exhaling. There's so many other ways to engage in mindfulness. So you might observe and describe an abstract painting. You might listen to music. What are some other ways that you might engage in mindfulness using your five senses? What are some things you like to do or teach when working with individuals? And while you're thinking, again, I'm thinking of keeping in mind as we are working with individuals, a lot of the work that we're doing is modeling behaviors. So we might be modeling mindfulness. We might be modeling what it might look like to, um, observe something in the environment. We might be modeling what it might look like to take a pause. We might be modeling what it might look like to really be in that present moment. Christine, that's an interesting question. Where do you feel you breathe most vividly? And so remember, if you can't observe it, you can't describe it. So if you can't observe it with your eyes, sound, smell, taste, touch, you may have difficulty describing or putting label or putting words or putting a narrative to these observations. With mindfulness how skills on the flip side, we are now looking at how to be mindful. So I am sitting in my seat, I am talking to you, and I am only talking to you. I am not thinking about my list of to-dos and 500 things that I have to do after this, and I'm not worried about what I am going to do the rest of the week. I am simply talking to you all. Although I may have, again, all of these other thoughts, perhaps you're thinking about all the documentation you have to do. You're planning ahead who else you have to see this day and the rest of this week. But mindfulness house skills, specifically one mindfully, is focusing on just this moment, and I'm just doing this one thing. So when we're teaching individuals how to be one mindful, we're talking about being completely present in this one moment. So one mindfulness is really the opposite of multitasking. And so Marshall Linehan said that the point of practicing being one mindful is so that we are not missing out on our own lives. Has anyone ever driven from point A to point B and you had no idea how you got there, but somehow you managed to get there safely? Yeah, a loud yes. And that may happen to many of us. We may be kind of on this autopilot, mechanical, going with the motions mode. And this happens, yeah, all the time, every day. Absolutely, yes. So with one mindfulness, what we're doing instead is we're teaching individuals when you're eating, eat. When you're walking, walk. Even when you're worrying, worry in that moment. Give yourself that time. So when you are waking up in the morning, and if you are like me, you may, which I'm chronically trying to slow down, but you may, for example, you might grab your cup, put it under your coffee pot, turn on your coffee pot, go to the stove, put on a pan, crack eggs into it, put your toast in the toaster, feed the cat, turn on your computer, log into Zoom, and you're doing 50 different things at once. But rather than doing everything 100 miles a minute, could you practice doing one thing at a time and doing your best to let go of distractions? Of course, this is not possible all the time, and it's not possible to think nothing all the time. Our thoughts are constantly coming and going. But could there be an opportunity to encourage the people that you're working with, or even practicing and modeling again for yourself, doing one thing at a time? So if you're making coffee, maybe you're simply doing that. You're lifting up the mug and noticing how it feels, and you're noticing the texture of it, and you're hearing the way that the coffee pours out of the coffee pot, and you're noticing the smell of the coffee, and you're, noticing the flavor of the creamer or milk that you're adding. So you're really submerging yourself into that moment. And yes, one thing at a time. But it's so hard to do that when we are living in such a fast-paced environment. So encourage you all to take a moment to practice and see if that is possible for you. Even if it's just 1 minute, even if it's just 5 minutes, is there a way for you to let go of distractions? And again, teaching these skills to the individuals that we serve can be quite helpful because we are modeling being in this present moment and focusing on one thing at a time rather than thinking about every other thing that we have to do, so that we don't feel like we are constantly moving so fast in the world and we are taking a moment to simply be. Okay. And yes, there will be a copy of the presentation and the webinar recording after. Okay, so I'm going to share a scenario, and would love to get your feedback on how you might support this individual. And this can be modified and think about perhaps the person that you're working with, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll use this scenario. So I'll read this out loud. So Jane is a 28-year-old cisgender heterosexual female, has a bachelor's degree in business administration, and currently works as an office assistant. Growing up, Jane's mother struggled with depression, and her father was often absent due to work commitments and a history of alcohol use. Jane struggled with her mood lability and anxiety from a young age. Despite excelling academically, her mental health issues intensified during college, leading to self-harm and substance use. In her early career, this emotional instability affected her job performance and relationships. She currently has trouble concentrating at work, is easily distracted, and regularly feels overwhelmed. And think about this, especially for the individuals that you work with, perhaps adding that layer of also experiencing a history of chronic homelessness or being unhoused. So now we have a person who is struggling with a history of self-harm, substance use, absence from parents, struggling on the job, struggling with relationships. How might you help Jane develop some mindfulness skills? What are some things that you perhaps might educate this person on? Whether it's from what we shared today, or perhaps you had some other ideas about mindfulness in your mind. What might you do to support Jane? I'll give us just a moment here. Christine, you're off to a good start. Christine says, number one, validate her experience. And that is absolutely the first part of DBT. We're talking about acceptance or that validation piece, and now we're combining the change piece. So what else do we need? See, exploring what to tackle first. Focusing on one task at a time. I see a quote, eat the frog, get the hardest task done first. Marie says, ask her how she unwinds and if she can identify something such as going for a walk, listening to music. I would help her infuse some mindfulness skills into that experience. If she doesn't identify anything, then I would help her to do so. Yeah. And some people may really struggle with identifying activities that they find enjoyable. So now you're struggling with finding ways to have moments of mindfulness, but think about the daily things that people do. People that we work with may struggle with those activities of daily living, but oftentimes we're all doing the same things. We wake up, we take a shower, we eat a meal, we brush our teeth. Are there moments to slow down? What does success look like for her? Suggest to write things down and review them on a regular basis. Go through an ACEs quiz to help her see how and what happened is influencing her here and now. Yeah. And seeing some of us are really good at looking at this in a bigger picture and zooming out a bit. I see examples, perhaps deep breathing exercises, noticing the breath. Absolutely. So that might include some of those mindfulness skills of simply observing. So what you do to be mindful, observing the breath, noticing the breath, encouraging her to take many breaks throughout the workday. Are there moments of pause? Can you simply be in a moment? Danielle says, ask when she feels overwhelmed. What has helped in the past and what does she find helpful now? Are there things that interest you or help you focus? Yeah, a lot of this, with all the skills that we talk about, are exploring a person's strengths. So what worked for them in the past, what didn't? How can we help offer something new? Can we offer a new tool to your toolbox? Exactly, I say identify current coping skills, try some good self-care rituals, different breathing techniques. Absolutely. And with mindfulness, we even talk about, if this is on the job or if this is at home, this might look like simply labeling, I notice I'm feeling anxious right now. I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. Asking, what does this person need in this moment? What do I need? Help her to celebrate how much she manages already and how to build and grow her management and attention skills. Yeah, identify strengths and needs. Absolutely. So whether it's finding current skills, teaching new ones, exploring strengths, what's been helpful, what's not been helpful, noticing what's coming up for her, whether it's physically. Sometimes I find the individuals that we're working with really struggle with identifying what's happening in their body, and people don't want to sit in their body experience. That can be quite challenging. But finding ways to incorporate mindfulness in her daily life. Wonderful. Okay. So really great examples, and thank you for participating in that. Again, keeping in mind how this looks different for each person. And I see many of you are very skillful in your ability to offer some feedback, and sometimes we can feel stuck. So using some of the skills today to incorporate in future, work with the individuals that you're working with. But just as we're wrapping up, again, I spent much of this first session talking about what DBT is and how it is very much a both supportive and validating environment. And it is also behavioral and skill oriented. So we have a combination of the two. DBT also helps individuals to build a life worth living and help them explore what that might look like. So a lot of this is instilling hope in their future. DBT does take a lot of time, energy, effort, commitment. Mindfulness is hard, and it does help a person to ultimately focus their mind on this present moment without attachment. I see another example in the chat, sitting in the pain and feelings and really feeling where is that coming from, and then looking at solutions. Yeah. So simply noticing, I'm noticing this feeling in my body. I'm wondering where it might be coming from. Absolutely. So with this, again, this was our first part of hopefully an ongoing, or I shouldn't say ongoing, a 4-part series, but right now we have 2 parts available. And so what I often encourage as I'm teaching and sharing and we're learning about DBT is to really practice some of these skills. And so it's your choice. You have the option to practice a mindfulness what skill. So that's those observe and describe skills. So observing through your senses, describing the environment, what's happening within you, what's happening around you. This can take a minute, up to 5 minutes, longer than that. You can do it multiple times. Again, your choice. You can practice mindfulness how skills. So taking a moment to just be in that moment. Pick one experience that you have every day. Again, everyone likely cooks a meal or eats a meal. If you go for a walk or you walk your dog, can you observe that experience without judgment and simply describe what you're doing or what you're seeing? What do you see, hear, feel? Or notice the 3 states of mind. So notice when you're coming from a place of emotion mind or reasonable mind, or are you accessing your wise mind or kind of that gut intuition that you have within yourself? And so it's so important to practice these skills before we're educating the people that we serve so that we can really have a thorough understanding of what this looks like. So hope to see you back again. Today was more of an overview and a little bit of mindfulness, but next week is my favorite and it's distress tolerance. So hope to see you there. Same time, same place, 12 to 1:30. We hope that you can take a moment to complete our evaluation. It is anonymous, so we do appreciate all your feedback. Whatever is on your mind, we are open and welcome to constantly improving and evolving in these trainings. So please do take a moment. Emily had shared the link in the chat, or feel free to scan here. I also wanted to share resources as well. Thank you again for your engagement. Please use the same link for the next session, session 2, which will again be next Monday, distress tolerance skills. But I wanted to share again, once again, these resources. So many of these are some of really the core ongoing handouts that I live and breathe by. So I personally have actually all of these. I currently don't work with adolescents, but have used these before. So the top 4 are my go-to, the top 2 in the middle. So you'll see DBT skills training manual as well as DBT skills training handouts and worksheets. Many of these are accessible online. If you're interested in continuing to learn about DBT, become board certified, I highly recommend checking out these 2 first links here, which we'll provide to you in this PowerPoint. Behavioraltech.org is Marsha Linehan and her colleagues who provide ongoing training and certifications for DBT. So it includes information, explanations, resources for practitioners and clients. And then Rutgers actually has a YouTube that talks in detail about small skills. So each video has its own skill, so a different way of learning. I'm a visual learner myself, so that might be helpful for you. But that is it for me. If there are any questions other than the ones that have already been asked, feel free to ask. If not, again, thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see you same time, same place. Use the same link next week for session 2, strategies for distress tolerance. We will send all of this information in an email with the slides. I will, if you're interested, email me for a handout, but this will all be emailed to you directly. I have so many things that I could share, so if you're interested, we will share that information to you. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you next week. Take care, everyone. Thank you.